Good morning, Simone. How are you?
Very good, very good. How are you, Mark?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, where are you joining us from?
I'm back in my bat cave in small town Italy, near Bologna, for people that would have an idea of Italian geography.
Near Bologna. Okay, a bat cave. That's an interesting phrasing. It's just thinking of you behind a waterfall or something. Is it full of technological devices and gizmos and?
It's actually very quaint, and it's where I kind of plan my missions, but most of my work has a global remit. So it's great to have the opportunity to be exposed and have the freedom to travel for work, see what's happening around, but also come back to a comfortable, cozy little town in Italy.
Yeah, it's very, you've got to have a nucleus, especially when you travel. There's got to be a place where you can shut the door and recharge and shut the world out for a little while. So thanks for letting us into your bat cave today to share this. So Simone, I mean, you do a lot of different stuff, but I mean, you're director of global ecosystem and innovation at Parchment, and you're a chair on various kind of groups and steering groups and things like that. In terms of sort of micro-credentialing and verifiability and trust and certification of learning and education. But more generally, I mean, you're very involved in the kind of Web3, Ed3 education space. So you can probably describe it a lot better than I do. When people ask you what you do, how do you frame it for them?
I try to say that I'm involved with education, technology, and food, where food is probably the one piece that we leave aside, but that belongs to my passion. But certainly the framing around ed tech would be right. I'd say it is really an opportunity that I've had to give back to something that was a life-changing experience for me, the opportunity to study abroad. Turned me from a dropout, close to be a dropout, to an A student. And I see it as my purpose to give back to education and support the development, let's say, of a global education ecosystem, particularly through the lens of credentialing, which to me is not just a technology, but is an attitude that taps really into a recognition mindset, in a sense, stretching it, gratitude, but it's, recognizing experiences that could be meaningful for students, for people, but can also be valuable for third parties, whether it's employers or other training institutions. And this has really put me at the edges of the organizations that I've been able to contribute to. I find a lot of excitement about being able to connect the dots, and I've been trying to connect the dots through technical interoperability, in a sense, for the majority of my professional life, which has mostly been involved in the higher education sector, working for credentialing companies, digital credentialing companies like Parchment, for example, but I've also had previous experiences in working on the, say, administrative legacy system of university, the student information systems, where data is really generated. And so originally the question was, well, we now have more data about, our students, about our learning that happens. How can we streamline the processes that really are supporting what I like to call just freedom? And it's initially was the mobility of students, at least in Europe, supporting the Erasmus program, which is one of the flagship programs in the European Commission or the European area, higher education area, that would allow students to study abroad. And so with students, travel information about them, money, and a whole scaffolding of agreements or smart contracts between institutions. And I felt that really just being able to take your information along, being able to share it, was an indicator of freedom. And education, in a sense, becomes that vehicle, particularly if you look at it from a global perspective and the ability to move around and to learn in different contexts through different programs, or really anytime.
Well, that's very much characterizes how, the discussions that we were having about the transitions in education, a lot more about it's freedom, isn't it? It's ownership, it's empowerment, it's, getting rid of all of this worrying about all the equivalencies between this and that when you cross the border, and trying to validate this qualification and evidence of learning in this place and all of this stuff. And now technology's really got to that point where we've stepped up. But I just want to kind of zoom out a little bit, because, you're very much on the vanguard of change, and things like micro-credentialing, which we'll definitely come back around to. Thinking for the, your average higher education institution that's out there, that maybe, say, if you go back to, say, even 2017, you still had that kind of flurry of anxiety when the institution said, we're going to introduce interactive whiteboards, or we're going to use Google Classroom or something like that, that's still very much the reality in higher education institutions. It was certainly accelerated hugely by the pandemic, but you still had a great deal of institutions, just the vision of technology was something like, let's take what we do in the physical classroom and replicate it on a Zoom call, a Zoom meeting, or use Microsoft Teams or whatever. And so technology for so many institutions and so many educators and learners, in that environment, has seemed like a complement. It's something to add on. It's like you think about it as an app, or, a tool. But it seems like the complete landscape of the way that technology and education integrate is changing really quickly. And it's at a point where even the late adopters can't really ignore it anymore. So I wondered if you could just kind of give us an indication of, even just sort of bullet pointing it. I know this is very reductionist, but thinking about the big shifts, if I'm a kind of late adopter in an institution and I'm saying, well, what's this about? Why should I care? Things like Ed3, what really is changing that will impact the way that institutions work, the way that teaching and learning works, that I really have to pay attention to? What would you say to those people?
I would tell them to just try to feel comfortable with what's ahead. The things are changing, but what has really changed is the rate or the speed of change and the acceleration that we're living through. So even in the span of 10 years, the first technologies that were forced into the classroom, as you mentioned, felt a bit foreign, and so we were not equipped to make the best use of those tools. And so there was a necessary moment of exploration and experimentation with these tools that probably were those created those lessons learned, the good failures. And clearly, when you have a tool at hand, like a hammer, everything becomes a nail. So we try to lead with technology. But I think we're realizing that the convergence of availability of technology, the shifting of the learners that we have coming, especially in higher education institutions, so non-traditional, no longer 18 to 22 years old, I guess global environments, external forces like COVID that are additionally accelerating change, are kind of converging and putting us in a situation where that is unique. Like, I feel that our generation, particularly the teachers' generations, is living through the change of an era. And I think they'll go from one era to another in their professional lifetime. This is also happening because of this acceleration that I mentioned, and it's not something that people have seen before in their professional career. So we have to be able to cope with new tools and a set of layers of changes that are happening at the political level, the technological level, but also in practice. How do we teach and learn every day? And so being able to see this shift could be scary, but also a great opportunity, particularly for the future generations. So I guess our generation working in the education sector here is going to be a formidable agent of change with all the strings that come attached with that, the challenges particularly. But I feel that we are living, if we were looking at eras, I think we're in another renaissance of learning.
Yeah.
And in a sense, when I think about that, I'm really thinking about micro-credentials and how they have really been able to realign, I think rebalance or retune the mindset of teachers, learners, and institutions around, what is learning, what is the role of each different training institutions or education institutions in the lifetime of citizens of a learner. And it's no longer compartmentalized, it's more composable, it recognizes different kinds of learning. There is no longer a bias that short online courses, are not fit for academia. Sometimes I joke saying that micro-credentials are MOOCs being rebranded, because MOOCs initially were kind of pushed out by academia saying, well, those are low-stake credentials. We would never credential that. But now there are numbers of micro-credentialing frameworks being put into place. The European Union, New Zealand's leading the way, Canada, everywhere. And this is just saying, look, you are in a position to enable this, the embrace change. And that is historically the role of institutions that have been around for centuries in some cases. And this is another one of those times. So by recognizing different kinds of learning experiences like micro-credentials and bringing them, connecting them back into your academic curriculum, that is where you're really removing barriers or tearing down walls that somehow have created a split between formal and informal education. And we've been talking about lifelong learning, and that's just another way of saying that barrier should be removed. And we should be able to capture that learning wherever it happens, whenever it happens, and stack it together so that it becomes your profile, your identity, and an identity that you can take with on your life journey and be able to share or curate according to the situation or whatever you see fit.
Okay, there's a lot in there, and I think that convergence is definitely a word that stands out, because and renaissance as well. I'm glad you used that word, because it does feel like that. And you kind of, it's difficult to obviously judge in real time. These are often words used through the historical lens, but it very much feels like it. I often liken it to the Gutenberg printing press as the basis of the kind of the Enlightenment, the revolution, the dissemination of knowledge and taking it out of the hands of the few into the hands of the many. And technology has simply stepped that up again. But in terms of a lot of the things you're talking about there, it's that convergence between Web3 and Ed3, and it's been kind of moving that way for a while, especially in K-12 and more informal learning and more of the schools and institutions on the vanguard, where you're breaking down a sense of, that subjects clearly should not exist behind walls. You shouldn't have maths in this room and English in that room, because when we're solving problems, we're using a range of things. And if we are directing our own learning, we're going to need to, when we want to know something, it's generally to kind of solve a problem or because our curiosity has been sparked by something, or I'd really like to know more about that specific thing. And we don't want to do a 4-year degree to find out about this little thing. We want to kind of put together our own learning to build a mosaic or a patchwork of things that suit us and represent and align with our passions and our values. So it seems like technology is saying, well, hey, this is now possible. Universities, of course, it's interesting you're talking about the kind of hesitation. I mean, what's shifting there? Because you mentioned, and I've experienced this too, this idea that it couldn't, MOOCs can't possibly be real learning because they're too short, they're not regulated, there's no depth. How do we know that the learning is taking place, all these kinds of things? So do you really think that's shifting? Are institutions really opening up to this kind of smaller compartmentalization of learning so that allows you to build personal learning pathways? Or is this just a few on the vanguard? What are you seeing out there?
I am seeing it across the board in higher education. At this stage, I think, particularly in the last 2 years, I guess universities, both from, say, the registrar's office to the instructional designer, are, I think, starting to ask themselves the right questions. And fortunately, but also not very romantically, this is also because the face of the students is changing. So the offering that they had, the monolithic 4 years, is no longer fit and is not attracting the students that end up also becoming part of the community and the stakeholders and supporting the community, i.e. paying money. So I think it's an alignment of universities to what's happening and across humanity, just the different lifestyles. This has ramification in a lot of things, but I guess the positive side effect of that is that universities have really started to pay attention and are starting to look within their own walls or campuses or ecosystems to see where could we start from? Like, what are the, say, co-curricular activities or life-changing experiences that we know occur in campus? Some of those experiences, I don't know about you, but in my life, have shaped my life more than anything else, happened, in those 4 years, but they were not necessarily academic, but they happened in that context. So universities know that they're offering more than academic training. Those are life-shaping experiences. And there's so much happening that they're not recognizing. And whether they start to recognize that for credits or not, this is kind of the debate. Like, how do we make sure that we formally recognize different learning experiences and stack them against a curriculum? And that's happening, and certainly it's a good signal, and it's no longer just a weak signal. I think it's becoming stronger and stronger. Therefore, it becomes a good predictor of where the system is going. And again, it's not just the Ivy League universities, wanting to partner with private vendors and creating like short courses that are more probably fit for the market needs. This is just really everyone, all the university, public and private. So in a sense, a lot of the burden of this change lands on the shoulders of the teachers. It is just, the tools are naturally helpful, but they need to be properly used. And so that took some time. But the moment you realize what kind of tricks you can play with technology in terms of assisting a pedagogical model that may be more incentivizing, more gamified, more emphasizing recognition, social dynamics that you can create in a classroom, peer-to-peer learning review. Those are things that I'd say we've seen develop with online learning platforms more and more. We are seeing probably this new era of the internet, the Web3, let's say, as potentially an opportunity for some of these movements to come together, to converge, and finally go into mainstream and shape the kind of new trajectory for education. Well, I would like to say also that, as we all have hype cycles around technologies, and I'm seeing in Web3 what I think is very interesting, at least for me, and I look at it from kind of the credentialing angle, is there are some novelties. I mean, the idea of ownership and being able to, I guess, be more responsible or have agency over your data is a thing that is enabled by technology. But honestly, that doesn't make a lot of difference to many people. Like, most people don't even know what that really means. Like, having a credential on your account feels like you can use it, and so they don't double click inside what are the sovereign ramifications or more, I guess, philosophical issues around ownership and so on. That is maturing. People are becoming more aware of that. But I'm seeing validation of interesting pedagogical model or approaches that, were already present in, across Web 1 and Web 2 that are being validated, that back then were being discarded or discredited. One example that I like to make is open badges. Now, open badges are, if you're familiar with the Boy Scouts badges, I guess, token of recognition that are now digital, and they could be issued to anyone for anything. But badges is a technology that is now gone mainstream, and I like to look at it as the ancestor of modern recognition technologies. And it started in an informal education space, particularly so in the K-12 range. And badges already back then had this ability to attach evidence to a credential, to add criteria. The design of an open badge already included this idea of endorsement. And those are principles that have been underutilized between, say, 2012 and now, but are now incredibly they're projecting, they're becoming the future of credentialing. Where in Web 3, maybe these other signals around a credential that could be an attestation that you have completed a course, there's so much meta information around that credential, which is not captured. And this could be evidence. So imagine that you, complete a course for public speaking, and the evidence connected to that digital credential that you received is the video of you presenting. Or let's say that you start to share that credential in the wild online, and then you start to get feedback from people, endorsements, likes. That long tail, I'd say, of the second market or the second layer effect of sharing credentials increases these mechanisms of connection with people, with the market. So credentials go from being, say, collectors of skills and achievements to connectors of people. And that is where that idea of recognition really kicks in, and I'm really, really passionate about it. And I see that Web3 is kind of tapping into, let's call it a nano credential layer. So the reputation layer that sits under a credential that could be verified and verifiable, but it actually increases in signal strength when you're able to capture endorsements. These are likes, praises, up scores, up votes. Those are all data points that are now in this Web3 world more and more abundant than ever. They are noisy, but because they're digital, we can append them to a credential attestation, and they probably provide a better measure of performance or current performance to that particular credential, even if it was verifiable. In a sense, if people have been talking about skills as currency, I think this additional layer, substrate, adds liquidity to that currency. And I think in Web3, the mechanisms and the tokenization of learning is just really a validation of this recognition mechanisms that did exist already, and that digital credentials were already able to represent, but it was probably a timing issue. And now this all is coming to fruition.
I wonder if this is all, thinking with my head on as, as a sort of course designer, and, I'm somebody that sort of, I'll write courses and get them accredited by accreditation bodies and stuff like that. So I'm very well aware of the kind of hoops that you have to jump through to get these things considered valid at particular specific levels, which is still, where traditional mainstream education sits at the moment. But what we're seeing, so if we think about some of the things you were talking about, which I would think about as part of maybe the education 2.0, that kind of shift towards, still within the general confines of traditional teaching and learning, you've got this shift to peer learning, you've got different ways to evidence learning. I still remember discussions I had even 7-8 years ago with accreditation bodies about trying to get self-reflection you know, as part of the assessment, you know, and the struggle I had to get that recognized, you know. So this is still part of that kind of education 2.0 world. But now, if we think about there's a bit of a shift towards skills now, of course, and skills, fortunately, there's quite broad agreement on levels of skills. You know, levels of knowledge is different, you know, and they kind of vary all over. But when you focus on skills and you think about moving from being able, you know, Bloom's taxonomy, being able to describe and identify and summarize, and then right up the pyramid to critical evaluation and analysis and all that kind of stuff, there's quite broad universal acceptance on those cognitive skills, you know, and capacities. So do you think that's one of the things that's opening the way to maybe a more universal recognizability, a universal framework? You know, because that's one of the big things. It's like, if we've got all these micro-credentials to evidence learning, but how do they connect in terms of, you know, level? How can you say that this one is suitable for this type of role, you know, as an employer? You know, so what's going on at that level in terms of, I understand that verifiability and trust and reputation is one thing, but in terms of the actual framework for level and intensity and depth, you know, as an employer, for example, how would you know what kind of frameworks are out there?
There's probably one too many frameworks, right? And I think the challenge here is, how do we make all these frameworks composable, to borrow a term popular in Web3? Takes just skills framework. Like, there are different standard frameworks to describe a specific skill. So I certainly would agree that moving down at skills level, it's just a much better way of assessing learning, recognizing it, and just the language, the common language. But even when we, you know, deal with, I guess, infrastructures that support skills frameworks, we need them to be able to be comparable or composable. In other words, I'm saying, even if you're taking whatever skills framework that you may have or qualification framework, no one is going to be the one bringing the rules them all. Like, you can make arguable decision and maybe practical because you need to move on and adopt a specific one, but you know, I'm seeing more and more compelling cases around being able to remix competence frameworks, and how you do it is a mix of, you know, having these frameworks being explicited or articulated in narrative. So this information should be on the web and should be published in linked data, which is a way to saying it should be machine readable, so that, you know, that allows the comparability with our existing frameworks and the remixing of competence frameworks or skills frameworks, so that there are relationships that can be built, there can be comparability, and you have these two layers, which, you know, one is the top down, so this is your framework of reference, but also the bottom up emergent, I guess, more social use of skills definitions that, you know, may need to span across context, because you as an individual may have been mobile and may have studied or had learning experiences across these skills frameworks. So the composability of them is important. This is also where emerging technologies like linked data, which is already mainstream, comes into play. And that's why, I guess, the modern credentialing specifications are all based on linked data, from open badges to verifiable credentials and so on. So there is that effect, which complements the view of, you know, accreditation bodies or formal institutions that provide genuinely tools to run this comparability or equivalences. So there, as in what you were saying, I recognize sort of this overarching, if you want to look at UNESCO, you know, the Global Recognition Convention, just this effort to really bring or create pathways or mechanisms to connect in the different qualification frameworks across the globe. And those are like narrative heavy, right? And so, but they do regulate, you know, whether, you know, if I come to study, like if I go to the US to study, I need to have my degree recognized or evaluated by a credential evaluation agency, and that has to kind of goes up to the Bible, the UNESCO Global Recognition Convention. But at the same time, you know, and it still requires a bit of manual intervention. An evaluator, you know, that has to go in and do the equivalencies. So I think with technology, we solved the verifiability, so the authenticity challenge. Right. Okay. Yeah. And that is where verifiable credentials go, but we have not solved yet the equivalency. That still requires brain power, which is more and more being taken on by AI. So I think we both need the structured data, linked data, right? But also the emerging algorithms that support in these decisions, you know, the recognition of qualifications to support mobility. So I'm not saying that AI is going to solve that and all the credential evaluation agencies are going to be disrupted. But in a sense, it's a mix of both. And that is already another one of the signals that we're living in this transition. We're crossing the chiasm. And so these new tech are coming in. And if we are in this domain right now, we need to be wise in being able to take them on and understand how they are shifting even our work, which may require reskilling on the part of professionals that are in that particular position, for example, recognition professionals.
Yeah, my goodness, there's so much going on. I mean, it sounds like AI is kind of at least taking the load so that the need for manual intervention is drastically lessened. And, you know, especially, you know, having worked with admissions and things in institutions, having seen that a lot of the work goes into verifiability. I mean, that's time saved immediately. You know, so we're just looking at the end of you know, the level of the qualification and equivalencies might need some manual intervention. But it seems to me that this is perhaps where the other aspect you were talking about was the sort of what I've heard referred to as the learning vitae, you know, this kind of very personalized learning evidence, a collection of learning evidence that you might have in your, you know, online wallet or whatever, that you can show to employers or further education that might actually carry more significance in some ways. No, so you've got your qualifications, you've got them verified. But I think if I was an employer or somebody accepting graduates into a master's program, for example, I'd be really interested to see this learning vitae. And you mentioned one of them, for example, a public speaking credential, and the evidence was the video of you doing it. So just for people who are curious about this, as I am, could you give us an example of what kind of things people might have in their wallets, you know, or whatever you're going to call it, to be able to present as learning evidence? What are the different media available? And what kind of things are you seeing out there that might actually lift an applicant off the page and actually give much more actionable information as to who this person is, what they can do, what their values are?
This is really the core of the issue. And I think if there was one message that I like to share is that, you know, we have now the possibility to curate our own identity online with the support of evidence. And now this evidence is kind of the limitation, if you want, is that it has to be a digital artifact. But we are now kind of collecting or leaving digital traces of ourselves everywhere. A lot of our experiences could be represented in digital. Even if any paper document that you're looking at today was born digital. So I think that is the availability. In terms of what could go into your backpack or a wallet, you know, you could have a mix of, you know, formal qualifications, but also think about things that are meaningful to you as a person. Attendance to events was another use case that was frowned upon, you know, back in the early days of digital credentials. And right now, for example, in Web3 is coming back with a vengeance. If you have not heard of this POAPs project, I mean, proof of participation, effectively, these are badges that are token, that are NFTs, in fact, that are issued to people that go to conferences, and people love to collect them and love to share them. And in fact, it proves that you may have been to every single, say, Ethereum conference out there, which has a very specific weight and a strong signal for whoever is looking at you and wants to understand, where you have been. And so those maybe become the long tail of your identity, but as you collect more and more, you have that agency to curate what you want to show for different purposes, whether you want to get a job or you want to project yourself into, through your more community service work. Really, anything that you could collect in your portfolio is gain, whatever is meaningful to you. And honestly, this is really, again, not a primitive that Web3 introduced. Portfolio thinking or folio thinking was always about being able to collect the reflections, so the meta reflections that got you to complete an assignment. The challenge has been there. I mean, how do we make this precious information consumable from someone that wants to verify, so that it's easy to dissect and to parse through? But really, digital credentials need to be are the evidence inside a person's portfolio, which is the same of saying a digital wallet or a digital backpack. So I think the power that we have in our hands, that we now have this means of collecting the shards of our identities. And with that great power comes great responsibility, because now the burden is pushed back to the individuals. So this sovereignty or agency or ownership that we talked about comes with price, which is becoming more responsible for that information. You have no one else that is taking care of it. You need to understand there are different ways of using and sharing data about yourself. Some of this data may be private and you want to keep it that way. Some of this data you may want to leave public. And that brings about this other conversation around, what goes on chain, which is publicly available for everyone, and what stays off chain, which is just for you to use wherever you see fit.
It's fascinating, and it seems to tie in with, if you look at how, I think of LinkedIn, actually, I think about as a network, if you look at how people wish to present themselves, there's very clearly a desire to say that my job title and my previous job titles and my qualification and my previous qualifications are not necessarily representative of who I am. And so if you look at how, on LinkedIn, you've got that kind of that personal summary box. You've got your learning badges and certifications, some of which are sort of self-certified. You've got the recommendations. You've got, now obviously that's all been driven by, it's bottom up. Otherwise it wouldn't work, right? So I think, what you're talking about seems to tie in with a general desire for people to say, I want to be in control of presenting who I am, and I want to be able to tell that story, and I don't want to be limited by what an institution narrows me into. I want to be able to say, this is me. And it seems like the technology is there to actually allow us to do so. And importantly, it's verifiable. So it's not like LinkedIn, when you say you were, director of X, Y, and Z, and maybe that wasn't quite the case, or you're allowed to kind of, amplify your role or your responsibilities. So you've got that level of verifiability underneath as well. It seems like it's an excellent development. It's a very positive development. What's the argument against it? I mean, are people afraid of this? Is there a lot of resistance from employers, from institutions, or is it just a universally positive thing?
So the verifiability of claims is, one fundamental challenge that we are trying to address, both at the policy level, again, the recognition, global recognition, but also technically, we have now way more tools and cryptography to being able to serve that use case properly. So to make sure that we, are able to produce verifiable credentials or pieces of information. The way this happens, is changing. We in the current Web 2 world, we rely on third parties, platforms, effectively, that maintain that do that verification for us. I guess the tendency to shift is to go toward more independent verification, and this is where technologies like blockchain come handy, and you no longer need the issuing platforms in the case of credentials to be in operations for a third party to verify, like in the future, that you indeed graduated from the University of Bologna, for example. So, but the technology there is in place, and as anything, there are probably one too many solutions to the same problem. And so the interop challenge there is to, how do we make sure that we have cross-regional, like global interoperability at the technical level, so we can talk the same language, but, and very importantly, is how, like, when we add this additional technological layer and to make things verifiable, how easy it is for relying party or verifiers to do this verification. Because, unfortunately, there are embarrassing statistics on how much credentials are being really verified, which is way less than you would expect, just because it's expensive, it's hard. So if we introduce technology to solve the problem, so make those credentials verifiable, but on the verifying party, there are sort of steps to get there. So it becomes even harder. Like, we need to be sure that we have then adoption of these verifiable credentials, that the support of these credentials to, I guess, a lifelong journey, or to be turned into opportunities, for example, by allowing you to get a job, should be frictionless as much as possible. And when you introduce new technology, you go through kind of a hype cycle or learning curve that initially is probably clunkier than what you have right now. So the user experience, for example, in this new Web3 world, or Ed3, is something that we need to work on. And we need a lot more designers to be able to play a role, so that we add the layer of verifiability, but we maintain the experience seamless and frictionless. Because ultimately, again, credentials are not the diploma, digital credentials are not the diploma, the parchment that you want to put on the wall. They need to serve a purpose. And typically these are to, on the enrollment pathway. So you want to continue progressing your studies and maybe apply for a PhD, or in the employability pathway when you want to get a job. Those are the functional one, right? And then there's the other one, which I think is the more exciting, and is just being able to have a reflection of yourself that you can curate and share with the world. It's probably when you meet someone, you don't introduce yourself by showing, I graduated from the University of Bologna, your verified diploma. Just like you don't show your wallet with your cryptocurrency. Like, the wallets could really house I guess a wealth of information about you that is more expressive. And this is really where NFTs are coming as a tsunami to usually provide another mean for people, that most people that are more familiar and live online, additional form of expressiveness. Like, this is the art that I like, this is the event that I went to, and those are verifiable things. So the beauty of it is that learning is part of your identity. For some, maybe more important than others. Certainly, when you think about the use of these credentials in a wallet, your academic credentials, like your degree from a university, the frequency of use of that credential is low. That must be said. Like, how many times have you shared your diploma with a third party? 3 times, 5 times in a lifetime? Yeah. So the low frequency of those credentials does not really help with the adoption of it. But the higher frequency of micro-credentials, like smaller tokens, participation of events that speak to your identity and that are current, I mean, you may end up using them way more than you use your academic credential. So they carry a different value for you, a different utility across a lifetime, but they sit next to your academic credentials and they may actually augment the signal of it. In some cases, your degree corresponds to what you do in life. In others, it doesn't. And so you would not couple it together, but it's the curation that you can do in how you present yourself that is key. And when you present yourself, this is the other big issue. The party that you're sharing this with should trust that. And so in the higher education context, this is particularly controversial because we're saying that instead of relying on the accreditation bodies or the issuing organizations, the learners becomes the proxy of truth, if not the source of truth. This is a fundamental shift that it's practice, and we're still kind of behind, but the technology is there to support it, the verifiable credential, as we said. The policies are saying that the UNESCO Global Recognition Convention says, non-recognition should be the exception. So I think, but the change management required to really honor or trust a credential that an applicant, share with you, MIT, that I want to apply. I mean, the current practice is I phone to the University of Bologna and check whether that's true, or you use third-party verification agencies. So there's a fundamental shift in this self-sovereign movement, or in this idea of learner centricity or learner gravitas, that require learners to be trusted as the source of truth.
It seems to me that, this is hugely exciting because there's so much letting go in here. There's so much by institutions. You're talking about learners as the proxy of truth, and we've seen it shifting. If you think about in a very rudimentary form to what might be called learner-centered approaches in everything from healthcare to education, person-centered counseling, learner-centered learning. There has been that kind of shift away from the didactic approach, prescriptive thinking. That's certainly something I think most people have become comfortable with, and rightly so. This is a whole different level. And what I love about it is that it seems to be broadening, because it's broadening the sense of what education is, and it's broadening the sense of how experiences have validity, educational validity, so that you can, it's like, there's something in Scotland, it's been around for a few years, called the Adult Achievement Awards, where they help people that have not really had the experience of formal education to reflect on their life experiences, and actually through reflective practice say what they learned about themselves, or what they learned about, a skill or something that they maybe learned from a neighbor or taught themselves from YouTube or whatever. And they get the opportunity to express that themselves. And this is just done on paper, but then they're given what's called an Adult Achievement Award. That's a regulated qualification, which to me seemed fantastic because it's broadening the sense of what learning really is. And it's not just the province of, academia. So we're talking now about access broadening, which is very, very exciting. And it seems, and just becoming comfortable with the fact that this is all emergent. We don't have all the answers. There's a fluidity here in terms of how it's verified and measured, but there's also an acceptance that it's bottom up as well as top down. And we've just got to become comfortable and embrace the process, because it seems like we are all, this is the thing about a renaissance. It's uncertain, it's evolving, it's emergent. We have to be comfortable with exploring it together. I think that's going to be difficult for some institutions. Things have been the same in sort of higher education for, well, Bologna, it's where it all started, isn't it? Yeah, if you go back 900 years, the University of Bologna, it still looked very much similar to what you see today. The fashion's changed a little bit, but there was the instructor on the stage and lecturing students. It's still very much like that. It's going to be difficult for institutions to sort of let go, but it's a very exciting time.
So you mentioned Bologna, of course. I'm in Bologna. Bologna is not only the home of one of the oldest universities in the world, but also of the Bologna process, which was one of the main reforms that really just opened up this idea of creating a European higher education area, free flow of student mobility, and great things that came with it. I mean, obviously it was a case of good aim, you know, probably less optimal implementation, but it was significant. But sometimes I reflect on, you know, the role. There is this debate whether Bologna is the oldest university in the world, right? And I guess it is by the measure that it was the first modern university, which is urban campus, and the university was not, you know, locked behind the academic walls, but it was the first university that really opened up the doors and was weaved into the thread of the municipality around it. So with the relationship with the institutions, with the local communities. And in that sense, I think that to me represent how, you know, that renaissance of learning, when we look at credentialing or just being able to use recognition in a more expansive sense, you know, in a sense that can help you to create communities, you know, being interested or experienced in a specific areas, you know, through the use of technology could allow you to connect with everyone that has the same interest or expertise. And so digital credentials could help with that. Imagine that if you could right click on, you know, a badge or verifiable credentials and send a tweet out to everyone that has the same skill or that has studied the same university. So there's a number of use cases that are that we could imagine. And so to some extent is that, you know, opening up of the university walls, the removing of those barriers that made Bologna the first modern university, but I also think they're coming back in this learning renaissance today that is really enabled by technology, where recognition to some extent precedes cognition. And this is a quote by Axel Honneth, which says, you know, if you show me that you're great at public speaking, I can clap, I can give you a thumb up. And that is the power of recognizing someone, recognizing the learning of someone else. And that act of empowerment, I think, creates community, is a strong signal that would be valuable also for a third party. And now we have the tools to really capture that. And that's very meaningful. I think that's unprecedented, and we can fine tune the use of technology, but I guess the whole social aspect and emphasis that is happening in Web3 and going from this idea of credentials to recognition and reputation is what attracts me and kind of feels that, you know, make me and people that I work with equipped to contribute to the evolution of learning in this new Ed3 space. Just bringing the asset that we've seen, that we have from Web 1 and Web 2, or finding immutable validation of those use cases. And so that is what really excites me about the future of education at this point.
So for educators, and this is just to kind of bring this to wrap up a little bit, because I think we've probably reached the point where if I was an educator, you know, working in an institution in curriculum development or planning or in teaching, for example, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of different branches to explore and a lot of reflection that's necessary for professionals to think about how this might look in their institution. If we were to actually broaden out our sense of learning, what would we want to capture? How would we capture it? Knowing that the technology is there and you can put some trust in it. There's a lot of reflection that's necessary before that evolutionary step takes place, and it's quite an exciting space. I wonder where they can go to start informing themselves. You know, what kind of resources are out there? Anything you can recommend for people in institutions that are like, I really want to start thinking about this. I want to start thinking about future-proofing our institution or my learning context to allow and support learners that are coming through this new generation to truly evidence the broader learning journey and that broader, richer reflection of what makes a person you, what makes, you know, what you want to say to the world. So where can they go to actually take in more and explore more about this?
So I'd say they can go places and they can do stuff. If you are in an institution, if you're a teacher, play around, start issuing digital credentials. You can start with open badges. They are freely available. There are platforms that allow you to play around with them for free. And so recognize learning that you provide, with these badges. You should do the same for the academy if you have not done so. So that for teachers is just a great exercise to kind of design curriculum that could be more stackable and that you can represent different steps along the way with badges, but also issue them and see what students do with it, see their feedback. That creates community, and it's that act of recognition that could be that could have higher frequencies. So not just at the end of 4 years, but every course, every skills, you may start to badge that. So there's a practical element to just really immerse yourself in this idea of, I guess, in the recognition space using technology. The other is more philosophical and maybe looking at the principles behind Ed3, which is Web3 for education. And just in the last few months, there has been a number of very interesting and curated resources that try to connect, Ed1 to Ed2 to Ed3. And bring it together, and I think I've started to make sense of what the future has ahead for us. Scott David Meyer comes to mind, is a prolific writer now. You should follow him on Twitter. I'm happy to share some of the links with you, and then maybe we can add it to this chat. He's published like a seminal piece from Web3 to Ed3. Ed3, although was already, I guess, a grassroots group of people that was coming together talking about technical standards. The Internet of Education as a meme is a strong one, and I would point people to it. Effectively, this is a set of the different utilities, 7 different utilities that are part of the technical infrastructure for this idea of an Internet of Education to emerge and to be available. And if you are already with a foot in the rabbit hole and you are hanging out in Discord channels, the Ed3 DAO is another place to go and learn. A lot of the learning that is happening in Web3 is really learning about Web3, about the new dynamics, the new primitives, the new technologies, wallets, buying NFTs or being part of a community that comes with the responsibility of having votes. You become co-founders of initiatives. So there's a lot of learning about Web3 that provides learning experience that are being credentialed. The other aspect is, if you're an educator, a K20 educator is another community that is really targeting teachers and helping them figure out what is the best use of these new tools for more effective pedagogical approaches, including the metaverse. So there is kind of a wide spectrum that goes from credentials to immersive learning experiences. So those are like 3, I'd say, places where to go and look. It just takes time, immerse yourself into it and reflect on it and share what you're seeing. A lot of the new learning is just the reflections of people that are becoming more vocal teachers and that are sharing their experiences, that are putting out there the challenges and the questions. Twitter is a great social network for, if you're like more into the Web3 space. There's a lot of great content that is very efficient. The Twitter threads are a good way to, I guess, intake all this learning.
Well, I've got some homework. So Simone, thank you. I feel like we could talk forever, and there's so many different forks and angles on this, but there's so much to think about. And I've written down the resources and the recommendations that you've given, so I'll certainly make sure that we share them. Universities or higher education institutions in general that are thinking about stepping more formally into the credentialing space, is that something you deal with? Are they able to reach out to you, or are you in a more kind of advisory steering panel sort of capacity behind the scenes?
No, absolutely. Practically, that's what we do. That's, my day job is to really help universities embrace this new technology, understand, how to make that jump, or, where to start from. Particularly, I'd say there is recognition technologies that is fit to support micro-credentialing strategies. So a lot of universities are now grappling with this idea: how do I, make a leap into micro-credentials? That's what I do and I'm passionate about. So that's conversation with higher education institutions on that front are very welcome. If people want to know more about what's happening in the technical specifications around open standards for learning records, I co-chair the W3C Verifiable Credentials for Education Task Force. If you're more technically versed, that's a good another angle. There is another work group within IEEE called the Integrated Learner Record that also convenes around these themes of trust in education, credentialing, and in governance. So I guess there's kind of a wide spectrum of things, but I said in the beginning, this is an infinite game, Mark. We can talk about this indefinitely, but those are a couple of practical things that I'm happy to have conversation with people if need be.
I can't thank you enough. It's been an education, and not only about the concepts and the inspiration, but I think it's the language as well. I'm noticing in the conversation, the language that you're using, the phrases, even simple things like using badge as a verb. It's all new, and the language is completely changing around education with the integration of technology, which is fascinating to me as well. I've learned about 15, 20 new phrases from you today, so I thank you for that as well. I'm going to be stealing them all.
Sure, here's the last one, and this is a good acronym, which is WAGME, which stands for We're All Gonna Make It. It's kind of you'll see it everywhere now if you dip your toes into Web3, but I think that's a good message that I'd like to leave you with. There's a challenge, but we're all gonna make it. Thank you, Mark, for having me.
I think we are. Thank you so much, Simone. I appreciate your time, and thank you for the inspiration.
Lovely.
Take care now. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.